when I started questioning what I know about money, what I know about banking, I started digging into this idea that I'm sure we'll get to today, which is how can you leverage your income differently to make sure that you're building real wealth in short order instead of just doing what most people do, which is pay their bills and have fun.
Welcome, Adam.
Hey, Robbie, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Really excited to have you here on the show. So let's get started, and maybe we can start with you telling us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm honored to be here first and foremost. My background is basically as a financial educator. About 20 years ago, I had realized that I learned a few things in the 2 or 3 years right out of college, and I had graduated as a debt statistic like a lot of people had. I was introduced to a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I'm sure you're familiar.
Yes, very, very much so.
And the book really started me down this journey of learning everything I could about personal finance, so much so that I started teaching it at the college level. And I've been a guest lecturer on about 750 college campuses all across the country over the last 15 years. That led me to doing a documentary on student loan debt, which was sold to CNBC. I got asked to do a couple of TEDx events, one of which went viral and has been seen by about 6 million people. And
Wow.
today I run a fintech company called The Shred Method, where we teach people how to blast away debt and create equity and liquidity in record time.
Wow, that's amazing. And before this podcast, I watched your TEDx talk, and it was fascinating. Maybe you could share the story with us that you talked about on your talk, because I'm sure many people here could relate to that.
Yes, for sure. My family is a game playing family. So we love to play ball games, dice games, board games, card games. But my kids really, really love to play Monopoly and have since the time they were young. And so we would play, but the games, I would ask you, how long have your games of Monopoly lasted?
Oh man, we quit. We can't even finish a game. We quit in the middle.
Yeah,
But maybe the 1 or 2 times we've actually finished with the kids, it's been like 2 hours.
exactly. And by the end, they're bored, you're bored.
Yes.
Everything else has to happen at some point.
Yeah.
And so we would play these hour-long games, sometimes spread out over 2 days of play. In the end, everyone would count their money and we would just see who had the most. It wasn't like a true game where you've monopolized the board, wiped everyone out, et cetera. And one Saturday I was watching my kids play and they were playing outside the rules. So they were buying each other out of jail. They were loaning each other money to buy properties. And the whole time I kept saying, guys, this is not how this game is supposed to be played. And we want to roll the dice. We want to move the pieces. We want to exchange pieces of paper. And I started wondering, Ravi, because I had just gotten back from a college gig, that what was the message that they were getting around the money, the slips of paper? Because today, the slips of paper in our game are tattered and torn and wrinkled and discolored.
Right.
And I started wondering, what if the money were real? If we were actually playing with real cash, would they play differently?
Interesting.
And so I added up, how much would it take to play a game of Monopoly with real cash? And it's about $1,500 per person in starter capital. And I assumed about $2,500 in the bank at any given point in time. And so with 5 of us and 2,500 is about 10 grand. So I went to a credit union on a Friday afternoon and I said, I need $9,990 in these denominations of bills. And of course, why, right? 9,990.
No, I don't know the 10. I don't know about the last 10.
So at 10 grand, you have to fill out all sorts of IRS paperwork.
Oh, okay.
Because they have to track any kind of transaction at $10,000 or greater.
So you knew this, so that
I knew this.
Specifically asked for that. Okay.
Yep.
Smart.
Yep.
All right.
And of course, all the tellers behind the bank, they're like, "Thank you so much for doing this." And they bring me the hundreds and 50s and 20s and 5s. You can't get $500 bills anymore at the bank or at a credit union. You can order them on eBay, but they're about $750 a piece. So I didn't do that. But I took the money home, set up the game board, and on Saturday morning, we played a high stakes game of Monopoly. And true to my hypothesis, the kids played differently.
That's interesting. So what were you trying to achieve? Now you said what you're trying to achieve is to see if your kids would play differently if you gave them real money. And what you found out was that they do play differently. And what does that tell you? I mean, what does that information tell you?
Well, even going back a little bit to my experience on the college campuses, what I was finding was that and this was my greatest fear, kind of realized that I didn't want to realize in my own children, was that 18 to 24-year-olds, by and large, are not making their own financial decisions on a college campus.
Yeah.
They're making decisions that exist within a bubble, and that bubble has no real consequences for another maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Right.
And so you'll have people that will get that first credit card for $1,000 and they'll use it. And then quickly the credit card companies increase what they're capable of using. And that's what happened to me. I had $8,000 in credit card debt when I graduated from school. So I had this idea that if the money were real, if it were tangible,
right,
that they would treat it differently, because then it wouldn't be just a slip of paper.
Okay.
And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Is they started being very conservative with the financial decisions they were making around the game board. And my wife and I both noticed, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, I think we're onto something here."
That's interesting. I remember back in college, I was able to get a certain amount of student loans, and I would use that as my bank account. So I was like, okay, I'm going out for the week. I need $500, or it was probably much less, maybe $150 or whatever. So I'd go and get some money out as a student loan, and that's what I'd use. And it wasn't like, just as you mentioned, it wasn't like I had cash in my hand, so I wasn't really feeling it. But I was very money conscious even back then.
Sure.
Growing up in an Indian family, like my dad would get upset if we lost a quarter. So it was like, so like I knew the value of money. But to your point, the way our kids are brought up, it's not like that. It's like we're buying things for them with credit cards, and like, they're like, I want this. Oh yeah, sure. Like, they don't really understand how it comes to them.
Right.
So what you learned in this experiment is that, hey, look, if the kids have control over this, and maybe it translates to young adults and even adults.
Yep.
Control over this, they have an idea that, like, it's a tangible asset that they have in their hands right there. It changes how you play the game. So how does that translate to what you're doing and what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah. How it translates, I think, in a real sense, is money is changing. And people have to understand how money is changing. So years ago, 40, 50 years ago even, the idea was you go to school, you get a degree, get a good job, stay at that job for 20 or 30 years, have a pension, retire, you're set. And today, that whole messaging is different. And as a result of the messaging, or needing to be different, it may not have changed entirely. I think people still think go to school, get a degree, get a good job. Today, I think school itself needs to be thought of as there's ROI to school, just like there's ROI to investing in a building or a multifamily property. So where it leads us to today is I'm trying to educate people that if we are very, very intentional about how money flows through our household, that we can actually begin to play the bank's game against the bank and win. And for the longest time, I think we've been brought up in a banker's business model, where you want to borrow money, the bank will say, here's how much you're eligible to borrow. Here's how much your payments are. And we dutifully make those payments and never question that arrangement, whether it's good for us or just good for the bank. And so I don't know about you, Robbie, but in my area, I could go in about a 2-mile radius from my home, and there are dozens of $20 million bank buildings that are being built right now.
Right.
And you look at that and you go, wow, they must be doing really well. Well, they're doing really well because we are their compound interest vehicle. We pay the notes. And quite often they're refinancing us every 2 or 3 or 4 years, which just resets the note back to zero again. So when I started questioning what I know about money, what I know about banking, I started digging into this idea that I'm sure we'll get to today, which is how can you leverage your income differently to make sure that you're building real wealth in short order instead of just doing what most people do, which is pay their bills and have fun.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, and it's really about being intentional with your money, because so many of us will spend the money up to our paychecks, and of course we save a certain amount, and it's fine. But when you ask a person that's a high income earner to produce a check of some substantial amount, like 100,000, 200,000, they just can't do it. They're like, well, we got to wait, we got to get a loan, this and that and the other. But what you have said, and we discussed prior to this podcast, was if you're making 200 to 300,000 a year, in 3 years, you should be able to write a check for $500,000 without a problem. You should have the liquidity to do that, which is a really cool concept. So what we'll talk about here is, just as you mentioned, like what we're doing wrong. How can we use the knowledge that these banks are leveraging our money and making a lot? How can we use that to our advantage? And how can we be able to have that ability, if we're making 200, 300,000 a year as maybe the sole income earner in our family, how can we have that ability, or create that ability to write such a large check?
Yeah. I think at the heart of this, one of the things we have to understand is that there are two great expenses in life, Robbie. One is taxes, which we do our utmost to try and avoid, right? And if you are a medical professional and you're W-2, or maybe you own your own clinic, there are certainly ways to build some tax savings into what you're doing. But I think you'd probably agree, one of the best ways to do that is to invest in some kind of real estate that it gives you a K1 at the end of the year and some bonus depreciation and things like that.
Yeah.
Cost segregation and all of that at the end of the year. All of these things we use to minimize our gross income. But it requires that you have some level of capital up front in order to get into those kinds of deals.
Right.
And so expense number one is taxes. Expense number two is the interest expense on debt.
Yes.
And what we don't always look at or are very intentional about is how much of our income actually goes out the door in debt payments, in debt repayments, and specifically those that don't really add to our net worth. So the student loan situation in America is unfortunate. It is necessary to get to a point of specialization that you're going to take out some amount of money. Could be $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in student loans or more. What I'm challenged by, and I've really fought against over the last 20 years, is the idea that we want to make the payments on that as low as humanly possible, and we'll just go for 20 or 25 years and then hopefully get it forgiven.
Right.
Because the challenge there is, A, we're kicking the can down the road. So the debt is always hanging there. It does factor into our debt to income ratio and what we qualify for and things like that for loans. But most importantly, it's all about how much interest is actually being charged against that debt, that as we're paying it off, that is just, we might as well burn that money. That's not money that's income. That money goes to our lenders.
Right.
And we call it the interest to income ratio. How much of your income every year gets burned by paying interest expense somewhere?
Yeah.
And I don't want to confuse people and think that borrowing money is wrong or bad, because I think debt has its place. I think leverage is a really powerful thing. But I maintain that the leverage that we have, realistically, if you're a medical professional, if you have leverage, it should be money that is being leveraged to make you more money.
Yes.
So it's less about the doodads and trinkets and liabilities that you're buying, and more about go buy the multifamily, go invest with people like Viking, because they're gonna create more income, allowing you to buy the car that you most want.
Yeah.
Right?
So and I absolutely 100% agree with that. I think it's important to invest that money wisely, because as you mentioned, you are, depending on how your debt is amortized, you're going to pay a high amount of interest up front.
Right.
And most of the time we are. But I challenge the fact that we need to blast away debt, because personally, I'll give you an example. We had a home loan, 3% interest rate.
Yep.
And it was 30-year fixed. And I'm thinking, I never want to pay this off. Like I want to keep that, because I can make more money, invest that in different types of passive types of investments, and like kind of play that arbitrage game.
Sure.
Right there. Like, why do I want to pay this debt off? So that's my question to you. Like, why does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me, if you don't mind, I'll share a story of a surgeon that we work with.
Sure.
And the surgeon bought his home, got an ultra low rate, was in great shape on the home mortgage. It was very, very low relative to what he was making every single month. But what was happening was his expenses between car loans, the club, his travel, everything was really ratcheting up. In addition, he had some commercial debt. So he had bought a building where he had a practice and felt really good about the fact that the practice was going to make a lot of money, but he was at a 5.75% interest rate on the commercial loan. And I said, the challenge, his name's John. I said, John, the challenge is that what you really want to do is you want to create liquidity to be able to deploy that money somewhere. And he asked me the same question you did, which is effectively, why wouldn't I just squirrel a bunch of money away over here
Right.
that I could use then to put into the investment? And it would be an investment much like what you guys offer.
Sure.
And yeah, I'm a big fan of syndications, and getting into syndications is just a straight passive income play with a K1 at the end of the year. And so as I started talking to him about it, the practice made really good money. The cash flow through the system was great. And when we showed him the shred method and how this works, I said, listen, in a few short months, you could create $100,000 to $150,000 in equity in your property that would then create liquidity, allowing you to go into one of these deals that you want. And it does two things, Ravi. One is you're accelerating the amortization table. And as in the first 0 to 5 years of a mortgage or a commercial loan, that's when the majority of the interest is really charged.
Right.
And so it's between years 0 and 3, ideally, that we can meet with someone and say, let us show you how we can save you tens and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process, which
Right.
is money you're clawing back from the bank in order to create the liquidity to go into a passive income investment.
So let's get into some more detail.
Yep.
If somebody's listening to this, they're like, okay, well, that sounds good on a kind of high level, but how would this work? I mean, maybe you can continue the example of the surgeon. Like, what did you do? What did he do? What did you do to make this happen?
So the first thing we did on the commercial loan, and just for round numbers, let's say there was $500,000 on this building itself.
Right.
He's in the Midwest, so he can still buy a building for relatively inexpensively.
Yeah. Right.
But $500,000 against this building, he had some equity. I think he had $100,000 in equity. We went and got a business line of credit for $50,000.
Okay.
So the BLOC, the business line of credit, effectively became his sweep account. Money would go into the BLOC, and that would be any kind of income that he was making just gets pushed directly to the business line. And the thing about a line of credit is it can only ever be 0 or negative. It will never go positive. You'll never have a surplus in a line of credit.
Yes.
That makes sense?
Right.
So our method and our software is continuously doing the calculations of, can we have access to some amount of that money, if even for a week or two, knowing that it's going to get replenished by income coming in the next week or two or 3 or 4 for that matter.
Right.
So in this particular case, if he was saying, again, for round numbers, that there was $30,000, it would be a lot more. It may be more like $60,000 a month coming in revenue.
Right.
Well, this system would say, listen, you've got $30,000 in deposits coming in. We need to make room for that on the business line of credit. So we're going to send $37,282 out of the business line to the commercial loan. And when you do that, if assuming we started at payment 1, by sending $37,000 in, what we're doing is we're accelerating the amortization table a good solid like 3 or 4 years worth of time, which is probably going to save on average about somewhere between $150,000 and $170,000 in interest over the life of the mortgage, because the majority of the interest is charged at the beginning of that deal.
Okay. So
he's not really, I would say, out any money, because as soon as the income drops in, it pays it back down to about $7,000 on the business line.
Okay.
And if you're tracking, we've only used it for just a short period, like maybe 4 or 5 days. So the interest on it is negligible. We've maybe spent tens of dollars in interest, probably not even that.
Right.
But we've offset $150,000 or $170,000 in interest on the business.
But then on the flip side, he's not generating that cash that's sitting in his savings account. It's all going towards the mortgage payment. So what if, say he's like, okay, well, now I want to invest into this particular passive deal, and he needs $200,000, but he put all that money into his mortgage. Like, how's he able to pull that out?
Yep. So the business, whatever line of credit we're using, if it's a business line on a commercial property or a home equity line on a personal property, we can use a PLOC in some cases. What it's doing is it's chasing whatever the equity number is. So if we started with $50,000 on the line and he drops 37 in, our goal is to go back to the bank within a handful of months. It might be, for most people, it's going to be 6 to 9 months, maybe 10, 12 months.
Okay.
But we'll go back and we'll say, could I get, I now have way more equity. Can I get $125,000 on my line?
Oh, I
Right.
see.
And so when it comes time, that is our liquidity pool that we turn around and go after. And if you're tracking on this, as we accelerate the amortization table,
Right.
more and more and more of the payments going to principal every single month. So
Okay.
you're making your monthly mortgage payment just like normal,
Right.
but instead of 80% going to interest and 20% going to principal, that starts to flip flop. And before
Right.
that, a good majority of your payments going to principal every single month. And so we'll probably get there in the conversation, but it may not be to pay the place off completely. That may not be our goal.
Right.
But our goal is to increase our cash flow on the business. And one of the ways that John could do that is, and we've shown him this, pay that thing down to 250 or 200, have tons of equity in it.
Yeah.
And then let's just recast the mortgage. Let's recast the commercial loan. So if
Right.
what was once a $5,000 payment, we can get down now to $2,200 a month. Well, John can do that in a surgery, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. We're effectively like decreasing the expense number throughout the process,
Okay.
increasing the discretionary income numbers, and then creating more liquidity that allow us to get into the deals faster.
So are you saying refinance after a certain amount of time? Is that what you mean by recast?
Not refinance. So where refinancing would be actually be rewriting the loan at a new interest rate and a new term.
Yeah.
Recasting may be new to some of your listeners, but
Sure.
you're effectively going into your lender and saying, this is what I started with, 500,000 at 30-year fixed.
Right.
I'm 4 years in or 3 years in on this deal and I owe 200,000. So
Right.
I want my loan recast at 200,000 over 27 years
Oh, I see.
at the exact same interest rate. And so what it does is it just decreases your payment. It'll fluctuate what your principal and interest payments are a little bit,
Okay.
but it's how I live in a 5,200 square foot home
Right.
and my mortgage payment is $393 a month. I owe $85,000 on the mortgage. I'll never pay it off, right? But I
Okay.
have $550,000 of equity that I can leverage at any point in time I want
Yeah.
because of the line of credit that we have against it. So
Right.
the goal was decrease your expenses to the ridiculous,
Yeah.
maximize your income, and then go put that money to work for you.
So do you have to go to a special bank to recast a loan, or would any, like a Wells Fargo, PNC, Bank of
Yeah,
America, would they all do that?
It's a good question. I would not say that all of them will do that because they probably won't.
Okay.
But if you're getting a loan from someone, you might ask them, is there a chance to recast this once or twice in the life of the loan?
Okay.
Many mortgage companies out there will do it at least once, and some will do it twice in the life of a mortgage.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. This is a really interesting concept. So basically, the way you start off is to get a HELOC, or a home equity line of credit.
Right.
That's the basis of this play. Now, you mentioned a PLOC. What is that? I'm not sure.
A PLOC is a personal line of credit. It would
Okay.
basically be tied to, it's a signature loan more than anything. There may be something collateralizing it. Generally speaking, PLOCs have a little bit higher interest rate. So that's why we generally trend towards a home equity line. But there's also something known as a cash value line of credit. If you have cash value in a life insurance plan, you could use that, where a lender or a bank will collateralize your line of credit on that. Similarly, you could do it with an equity account. So if you've got money in stock somewhere in an account, you could also do a line of credit against that, and it would function the same way.
Okay.
We tend not to go that direction just because we'd hate to have a margin called of some kind. So that's really more geared towards someone who's very savvy about their investments.
Right.
But that HELOC is relatively easy to get. And I maintain that if you have equity in your home, you absolutely should have a home equity line of credit. Even if you never used it, it is
Right.
yet another liquidity pool, because the only way to get money out of your home is either a HELOC or to sell it or to do a cash out refinance.
Okay. So you get a HELOC, PLOC, or any line of credit that is available to you. Most of the time, HELOCs offer the lowest interest rates and
Yep.
will give you the largest amounts of potential credit that you could use.
Correct.
So you get that, and then you start and you look at your cash flow, and all the excess cash you put towards the principal payment of your home, and you just continue to do that. And if you need extra money, you pull out of the HELOC. And every 6 months to 1 year, you refinance the HELOC so you can pull more out.
Yep.
And then at some point, whether it be 2-3 years, then you recast.
That's
Is
right.
that right?
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah. Yeah. If you were to break down steps 1, 2, and 3, you nailed it. You nailed
Okay.
it. And
Awesome.
yeah.
So then you recast, and then your payment drops even more, and then you're putting more towards the principal. Oh, that's an ingenious solution. This is the first I've heard of it, and it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I was with a group of real estate investors over the weekend in Phoenix for a conference, and they were asking me the same kind of question that you would, which is, why would you ever pay the debt off? It doesn't make any sense to pay it off. And the beautiful part of this is while I call it the shred method, it's really a mindset. And for me, I will never go back to the way that I used to bank, the way I used to function, because it's really inefficient. So to put it into context, our money, our income should really be doing 4 things at once, Robbie. It should pay our expenses. It should eliminate debt. You should be able to build wealth, and you should be able to do good or have fun with it. And what most people do is they pay expenses and they have fun. And those are the only 2 things they do.
Yeah.
Never really eliminate debt, never really build wealth. But if you're using this model of cash flow, you can actually do all 4 of them simultaneously without really changing your lifestyle. So this is not a beans and rice kind of deal, right? For the Dave Ramseyites out there, God bless them. If you want to live on less, that's your deal.
Right.
But for us, we like vacations. We want to take $20,000 and $30,000 vacations.
Right.
And we can do that using this model because the liquidity is there, because the cash flow is flowing through the system. You're not paying that much interest on the amount borrowed anyway. We're saving tens and potentially hundreds of thousands on the interest that we would normally spend on a mortgage. So that might be the money that you're now looking at for your vacation or your new car or whatever it may be. So it is a method, but it is much a mindset. And for me, it's a way of life. Again, I'll never go back.
Now, I guess the caveat is, because there's always downsides to every technique, every distinction, every plan, and maybe we can talk about that. Because the way, if I see myself doing this, I could see the bank account has maybe $200 in there, and I'm like, well, I want to go on a $20,000 vacation. I've got to borrow for this vacation. It looks like it changes the kind of comfort level of doing these types of things. So maybe talk us through that. What are the downsides of this, including that example?
Yeah, that which is a great example. There are a lot of people who are used to their level of, call it affluence or security or safety or peace of mind, is how much they have in either checking or savings at any given point in time. Mm-hmm. Right? I feel good because I always say idle money is dangerous money for most people. Because if it's sitting in your checking account, you're like, well, yeah, let's go get a steak dinner, or let's go to the show, or let's go buy a new pair of shoes or whatever. Because it's sitting there, right? And I maintain that our goal really should be, if we make a lot, that money the majority of it, if we're savvy, should be going to work for us at some level.
Yeah.
Because I know your audience, I believe well enough to know that their goal is not to work 5 or 6 hours or 5 or 6 days a week, 80 plus hours a week for 30 years.
Right.
We deal with a lot of dentists, a lot of chiropractors, a lot of attorneys. Their goal is to work less and less while making more and more.
Correct.
And so what you have to do is you have to put some of that money to work for you. So what will shift for most people is that idea that, oh, I have a ton of money in savings, I'm good, to look how much equity I have in these 4 or 5 different properties or investments, and look how much passive income we have coming in. We're good. We're good to drop 20 grand or 30 grand on a vacation, because we know through the shred method and the software that powers it, that within the next 2 or 3 months, all of that is chewed up by our income anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So in effect, we're just being way more efficient with the money that we're spending. And one last comment I'll make on that is, part of our strategy is that everything that you spend money on will eventually go on your credit card. So we're gaining miles and points and cash back and whatever else we can, because the HELOC or the PLOC or BLOC is just going to pay that off at the end of the month or the end of the grace period.
Right.
So again, we're leveraging some of the bank's money for 15 or 30 days.
Yeah.
And then we pay it with the line of credit. because our income dumps in, the amount of interest we're paying on it is virtually negligible.
Right.
So again, once you get into it, you understand the flow of money, you realize it's really not costing you anything. It's a net plus savings on
Right.
all the debt you're paying off to borrow a little bit to go on a vacation.
And I'll continue to use the house or the home as the example because it's probably the most common line of credit that people would achieve. But you're basically using your home as a savings account.
Yeah, you are as a bank for sure.
As a bank. Okay.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you have $80,000 left on your own mortgage and you've never paid off. Why wouldn't you pay it off?
Well, at $393 a month, it's kind of ridiculous. I can leverage the 80 grand that I would pay it off with somewhere else and make really good returns on it. And that's kind of my mentality is where can I create a higher arbitrage or a higher leverage point? We got to a point, Ravi, on that note where our original payment was around $1,600 based on the amount of money we borrowed. And that's no escrows included. That was just principal and interest.
Okay.
But because we had blasted it away so fast, we got to a point where roughly of that 1,300 of it every month was going to principal and 300 of it was going to interest. And so I mentioned the interest to income ratio. Our interest amount on an annual basis was like $3,500 to $4,000.
Okay.
And when you're on the kind of income that we're on, it's a small digit percentage of how much money we actually make is going to interest every year.
Okay.
But we still get, we do a standard deduction. If we itemize, it's on real estate in an LLC. So the reason that we ended up recasting was I was going to see how ridiculous can we get this, and we got it down to $393.
Okay. So what you're saying is, because it sounds like a spectrum, right? So it's like at a certain point you want to continue to pay off your mortgage payment, increase that line of credit, but you get to a point where it's so low, and I guess that's different for different people, but it's so low that it doesn't even make sense to pay it off.
That's right.
You're going to take care of it over time with principal interest and principal being so high.
Yes.
It'll just take care of itself over time.
That's exactly right. And the end result that I think I would put this out to doctors out there too, that the end result ought to be to live free.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is get to a point where your passive income investments cover your monthly mortgage, because now everything you make should be going to just expand your wealth. It'll either go to your lifestyle or it'll go to your wealth.
Right.
And for most people, it's 30% minimum usually is what they're paying in housing expenses.
Right.
But what if you could live free and you could do it in a period of 3 to 5 years?
Right.
That is the goal. That's what we teach our users, is how do you get to a point where you're living free and then the rest is going to really explode your massive passive permanent streams of income.
Okay. So we're talking about the downsides of this earlier. One of them is that you have to adjust your mentality on how you're getting your money for vacations or extracurriculars or whatever you're using it for.
Yep.
But then also you have less money at the beginning to use for these different types of activities, right? Because you're putting more towards the home, you have less free cash flow. And we were talking about those folks that would live almost paycheck to paycheck with the golden handcuffs, making a lot of money, spending a lot. They would have to change their behavior. Is that true or is that fair?
It is a fair assessment for the most part, but what we end up doing at the very beginning, Ravi, if it's all just discretionary spending, then yes, we would tell someone, hey, you're overspending your income. Right. You need to create some margin between what you're making and what you're spending. It doesn't work. And the shred method and the shred software will literally say, red line, it'll say there's not enough discretionary income or your line of credit isn't big enough to move forward.
Okay.
So we have kind of some metrics and some levers to pull, if you will, to let people know that they're either way up to the line or they've got room. The reason that I would say it's a fair assumption, sort of, is if someone's got 2 or 3 car payments, they've got a bunch of sinking funds that they're building, we would say, listen, let's reorient some of this cash flow so that we can actually use it to shred with. And one of the ways we do that is if somebody's got let's say they're buying their car and they've got a $700 car payment. Well, $700 a month is a lot to go towards shred. And so we'll go after that debt first, and we might knock that debt out completely. We may knock it out completely using the line of credit, to be quite candid.
Right.
But what we're doing is we're paying an interest-only payment on that debt for a period of time in order to free up the $700 to begin shredding, to begin activating the shred tool.
Okay.
And what often happens is someone who's got 2 or 3 car payments going because they could afford it, right? And there's a lot of people out there that are in a cycle where like they bought because they could afford it, but they have paymented themselves into a corner where the payments themselves don't allow them to shred debt or build wealth,
Right.
because of all the doodads that they're paying for every month.
Right.
And so in terms of changing things for them, it may not be a lifestyle change, but it's definitely a behavior change in terms of how the income flows. And we're really good about, in the first 90 to 120 days, coaching people into how it should be working.
Okay. So let's talk about another example. I'm thinking about a particular friend of mine who is incredibly excited to get I think it was a 2.7%, 15-year mortgage loan on his home. And he was just like, this is phenomenal, paying a lot up front, but 15 years and the interest rate's so low.
Yep.
It's great. And what would you say to someone like that? Would they, or number one does it make sense to even get a 15-year mortgage? But
right.
Number two, should they still do this method that you're discussing?
So this is a really interesting question, because 15-year notes are great in the sense that there's very little interest that you're being charged on it, particularly in the 2% range.
Right.
I mean, kudos to your friend. Amazing job.
Yeah.
The challenge is you're stuck with a really high payment.
Yes.
And that for most people is where, now if he's a physician making decent money, then maybe it's not a big deal. It may be just a fraction of what he's making. In which case I'd say, yeah, keep it and don't worry about doing shred necessarily. I would say as payments go and he's making more and more payments, he's creating more equity in the property. He ought to have a line of credit against it that he could then deploy some of that equity into somewhere that would allow him to arbitrage. What I will often tell people, though, who are saying, should I look at a 15-year fixed at 3% or a 30-year jumbo at 4.5%? I'll say, well, listen, if you're using shred, you want the 30-year fix because it's a smaller payment. So it creates more discretionary income. And we have a lot of people that have even a 3 or 4% mortgage rate where the effective APR, because of how shred works, is in the 0.6 to 0.7 range. So at 3%, somebody goes, oh, this is the cheapest money I'll ever get. And I can show them, no, based on your income, we could get you down to 0.4%. Because APR is really spread out over the length of the loan itself, right?
Right.
If somebody goes, oh, I'm paying 3% on my money. Well, you are over the length of this term, but you're paying a huge chunk of what your payment is towards interest in the first 5 years of your mortgage. So if you just said first 5-year snapshot, it's a lot higher than 3%.
Okay. So the way the amortization schedule works in these banks is that if you pay down a certain amount of principal, the schedule shifts.
It does.
Basically, right? So like if you're paying, so as you mentioned, if you're paying off more and more the first 2-3 years, it shifts like 15 years potentially down so that you're paying less interest and more principal.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So basically what you're saying is continue, get the higher interest rate 30-year. Is that, did I hear that right?
If someone's going to use shred and they're interested in creating more discretionary income,
right,
I wouldn't be afraid at all of doing a 30-year fixed with a little bit smaller payment.
Okay.
Because even in the first, say, 12 to 18 months, if you were using the system, you will have accelerated the amortization table well below the 15-year mark.
Right.
Right. And that's ultimately what your friend was doing. He said, I don't want to start at 30. I want to start at 15. I want to start at payment 180, not at 1.
Right.
If we're talking about a 360 payment deal.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Got it. And you could do that on your own, and you can do that on your own schedule. So you're not like tied to that high payment
100%
every month. Okay.
Yep.
So the other thing you mentioned was an arbitrage play with the HELOC.
Yeah.
And you can invest passively. Now, so I think this answers that initial question. How can somebody making $200,000 to $300,000 a year cut a check for $500,000? And the way you do that is to do the shred method, put that money down into your house so that you can cut a $500,000 HELOC check, basically.
That's right.
Now, that is dangerous because if you invest in something that doesn't perform, you're stuck with that high, that payment. You're paying down the HELOC, that percentage interest. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it would be a very, very special case if I said, go write up $500,000 check on a line of credit, particularly on a variable one that's now at 7.5 or 8%. That would not make a ton of sense.
Right.
But if this is a stabilized property, it's got guaranteed returns. When we talk about arbitrage, and I would hope that you guys even are counseling your clients on stuff like this, that if the money is borrowed out at 5 and you're going to make 9 or 10, and there's some back end play when the deal closes, that's different than if you're speculating on 7.5 or 8% on a non-stabilized property, and you're not going to earn anything on it for 2 years. That's a little bit more of a gamble. That'd be a risk I don't know that I'd be willing to take.
Right.
So the liquidity pool that I mentioned, how would you write a $500,000 check? It really does need to be placing. You got to place that money somewhere. It's going into a bucket that you're going to draw from. And I like to think of having multiple buckets that I'm drawing from. So if you were to say, Adam, how would you come up with $500,000?
Yeah.
A piece of it, a chunk of it would be home equity line. A chunk of it would be a whole life policy where we keep cash. And a chunk of it would be through a self-directed IRA if we were using that.
Okay.
Right? We always have multiple buckets going. And we're at a point where some of your clients may be different, but our investments generally in the $50 to $100, maybe $200,000 range. And we just know that when we empty a bucket, that bucket's going to fill back up again using shred. And then we're going to empty it somewhere else. And every time we empty the bucket, the intention is that the spigot filling that bucket up gets bigger and bigger.
Got it.
I always use the analogy like, do you have kids, Robbie?
I do.
Have you ever taken your kids to a water park?
Yes, many a time.
That giant bucket of water that fills up and then just comes crashing down on kids below.
Yes.
That's the way I like to envision what we're doing is we're filling up this giant bucket of water. And then the goal is to empty it every now and again.
Right.
And we would empty it into investments the likes that you guys provide. Because we know that if we can dump it, and when we dump it, maybe we're paying 4.5 or 5%, but we're probably making 8, 9, 10, 12, 15% on some of those investments.
Right.
We're willing to take that risk to create that arbitrage because we know that even the 4.5, 5 that we're borrowing is steadily getting paid back through the shred method.
Over time.
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Okay. That does make sense. A few more questions before we wrap up here.
Sure.
What banks can you recommend or do you recommend that people go to get these home equity lines of credit? Because when talking to some of these big banks that I have, for number one, it's very difficult. They'll push back a lot. Their terms are sometimes non-negotiable and difficult. And number two, about recasting and readjusting the HELOC, some of these banks won't do that. So what banks have you had success with?
By and large, the institutions that we're sending people to are credit unions. They're local credit unions and some local banks. And the reason for that is the Bank of America's, Wells Fargo's, US banks, Chase banks, a lot of them are going away from HELOC business.
Okay.
And many out there won't do a line of credit against a rental property even.
Right.
Which is why we tend to do more with a BLOC, a business line, because you're getting that on an LLC, not necessarily on the property itself. So they're going to underwrite that based on how much cash flow do you have coming through your LLC. But the local credit unions, they still like that debt. It's a good performing asset for them.
Right.
And so they're willing to do a line of credit on a property, usually a primary home, sometimes second or a vacation home. But by and large, that's where we're going, local banks, local credit unions.
And do the credit unions and local banks use the property as collateral, or do they use your W-2 income or whatever income you have as collateral as well?
They're going to underwrite it. So they're definitely looking at your income. It's interesting. I think the deeper your relationship goes with that institution,
yes,
the more variable that becomes, because I have a really, really solid relationship with the CFO at my credit union.
Yeah.
And I would say, hey, my property increased in value. He'd go, how much do you owe? He'd pull up the assessor's page, see what it's about, what it's worth. And they'd say, yeah, we can give you X. And there's no no appraisal. Now I may be a little bit different, and I'm in Iowa. There's a high level of trust here in the Midwest,
Right.
but I think if the deeper your relationship is, the easier it becomes to go do that.
Yes. That we've experienced that ourselves as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you mentioned that your shred method and the software you have. Maybe you just talk a little bit about that, and if somebody's interested in looking into that, how they could find out more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Theshredmethod.com is our website. And at the website, there is a masterclass that runs about 25 minutes or so. Ravi will tell you everything you need to know about how the shred method works. And then our system really it's a course that teaches you how to do it if you want it, if you're a do-it-yourselfer.
Right.
We have a community of people, of shredders, who get together on a regular basis, and we have wins and support calls, and we have a network of folks that we bring on for education purposes. And then the software itself, and the software I like to call a behavior modification tool, because the banks have taught us to walk heel toe, heel toe. And this thing will teach you how to walk toe, heel, which feels really weird.
Yeah.
Until you get used to it. And after about 60 to 90 days, 120 days, most people are just generally in the feel of how this works. The software does a great job of sharing that with you. So there's a registration fee for the course. The software is a small monthly fee. And anybody that joins us is always part of the community. So check it out at theshredmethod.com.
Now, could you just do it based on our conversation? I feel like I have enough information to just do it on my own. I mean, could you just do it on your own? Is there something we didn't discuss that maybe it wouldn't work if I tried on my own?
The secret sauce, so to speak.
Yeah. Is there a secret sauce there?
The secret sauce in our software is that it's down to the penny. We give you numbers that will tell you exactly when either you're out of debt or you're hitting certain levels in your debt load. But in candid answer to your question, no, you could do it.
Okay.
You could totally go do this. And there are people out there who will. I think the challenge and where our service really adds is that behavior is ingrained. And so someone might do it for a month or two and go, it's just easier for me just to run the way I always have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And to put it bluntly, the way that most of us operate financially is very inefficient. Right. I mean, if you were to leave your home in the morning to go to the grocery store, and you came back from the grocery store knowing you had to go to the post office in the afternoon, would you leave your car idling in the driveway all day?
Right. No.
And why not?
Yeah, it'd just be very inefficient.
Yeah, totally inefficient. Yet most of us, we park our money in an account and it sits there for days, weeks, months on end,
right,
while we wait to figure out what to do with it. All the while these banks around us are building $20 million buildings. Like, cool, thanks, appreciate it.
Yes.
So why not just create efficiency where there is now inefficiency, and the software helps you do that. But short answer to your question, a guy as smart as you could go do this for sure.
Yeah. And not just me. I'm not, there are a lot of people that are smarter out there than I am. And what you mentioned seems to be very doable, very feasible.
Yeah.
And I totally get the behavioral aspect of it. It's just kind of like, I focus a lot on diet and exercise. And when I talk to people about those types of things, they're like, oh yeah, okay, it sounds good. But then when they get to it, they're like, I'm just going to go right back to my old ways because it's just easier. So I do get that in multiple avenues of life, finances being one of them. And I just want to, one last comment is about that arbitrage play with your HELOC. We advise people not to do that typically when they're investing. Like, hey, I can pull this X amount of money for my HELOC and invest with you guys. We're like, I don't know if we should do that because it's a riskier proposition than investing cash. But I think if somebody understands your method and really knows that they're taking it out, but they're slowly going to fill that bucket back up, it certainly makes more sense to do that. So I would just say to the listeners out there, like, be careful about that. But if you truly understand what you're doing, we're not going to stop you, but just keep that in mind.
I would echo that sentiment. You can go out over your skis real quick.
Yeah.
And so for us, the people that we really love to work with are those that are living on significantly less than they make anyway.
Yeah.
Because when let's say round numbers again, you're making 30 grand, you're living on 10, right? 20 grand a month goes a long way as you're starting to spin this thing up.
Right.
And you can fill buckets in very quickly at that level and create freedom for yourself in short order. And so I would echo your sentiment that I don't know that I would say, hey, go long, six figures long on a HELOC into an investment if you don't know what you're doing in this process or you're prone to overspend.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always with caution.
Always with caution. And I will say the best diet and exercise book I ever read was a 1-page PDF called Shut Your Pie Hole and Get on the Treadmill. Oh, it doesn't take much, right? It's just figure it out.
That's a good metaphor for finances too. Shut your pie hole, get on a treadmill, pay off your debt, and invest properly. Awesome. Well, Adam, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much for joining. I'm sure our listeners got a ton out of it, and we'll put all that information that you shared with us in the show notes as well.
Appreciate it, Robbie.